speaking about law firms. Yes. It's through academia, but one out on is also the culture. Absolutely. The harassment of young lawyers, not just female lawyers, but also young lawyers in the culture. In terms of sexual harassment, a woman walks to the courtroom and she immediately feels uncomfortable because she knows that I do following her. She knows that side comments will be. And I'm not sure that male lawyers experience this level of tension when they walk into a courtroom. You really begin to adjust and try to find your seat as quickly as possible. But it's also judges as well. Maybe not harassment, maybe not sexual harassment, but how they speak to young lawyers, how they talk down to young lawyers. And being in a courtroom where a judge was yelling at a young lawyer, define destiny, define destiny. And I'm like, nobody walks around with definitions in their head. If I called even the best taught lawyer out on the spot and said, define this thought concept, that shit was demonstrated, I think, when the current MP president was presented to power. It was a clear statement by young lawyers that, listen, we recognize that historically young lawyers have been relegated, but as millennials, as Gen Zers, we are here to demonstrate that we now have power. We're not afraid to exercise that power. It might be the network of in-house counsel who will say, yes, this law firm has a reputation and we are regulating them. It might be when we go to the polls and say, we will vote for a candidate who has demonstrated and who has not been afraid to say that they recognize that young lawyers have peculiar issues that need to be addressed in the profession. Now, to hopefully speak to the question at hand, which is the Me Too movement, and I think it will always be true. However large we want to cast the net on any movement that wants to base on the false allegation or whatever. But that's not what I want for. I think it might undermine what we're trying to do. To say, oh, well, somebody might be falsely accused. The statistics, the research has shown that the incidence of a young woman falsely accusing somebody of sexual harassment is missing compared to the people who actually harass. So why are we focusing on the division? I think it diminishes what we're trying to do.
And to add to what you just said, the last bit, when people come out and say Me Too, we forget to think for a second that after a victim has come out, these people with power also intimidate them, force them to withdraw their statement. So many scenarios, you see a woman comes out and says, this person has me, and this person is a powerful person. And just as you're trying to canvass and look into the issue, the next day they've brought out an apology because they've been threatened.
There's no benefit to being a victim of sexual harassment. At least not now. There's no benefit.
What assurance can I get from that organization?
Thanks for that. I think that's a dicey situation to be in. Like I said earlier, the first port of call, or for me, when that kind of situation arises, to think about your wellness. Are you sure you're mentally prepared to be in that organization, knowing that you continually face this level of harassment and bullying, whatever form, sexual, personal, anything. But if you decide that you want to stay because you believe there's certain perks or benefits you get from it. I think it really depends on if the organization has shown their willingness to address that issue. So if they haven't shown that willingness, then it's very risky for you to stay back because it means that such things keep happening. So that's why it's important for the NBA to help ensure, and I highlight law firms particularly because the NBA has, a measure of impact or influence over law firms compared to companies or compared to universities, for example. So the NBA has to, and I imagine that that's part of the work of the NBA, the policy to belong today, and to ensure that there's a minimum standard that all law firms have to adhere to. Like Mr. Jekwe said, there's the legal profession in Nigeria is highly unregulated. We're allowed to do as we may, and that's why everybody does just what they want without any form of repercussion. So it's important to have that minimum standard that every law firm has to adhere to. And if they fail to do that, then you can put in place an ombudsman or a complaint system. The problem most times when we talk about you reporting to HR or reporting to a managing partner, in the organization, is that it's likely that nothing will be done about such reports. That's why it's useful to have an external system and ombudsman. And I'll refer to my incidents. I want to talk about briefly about my own perspective on this also. There was a time I had. I'm currently in school. I'm pursuing my doctorate degree, and I had an issue with a professor in school, and I couldn't think. I thought about going to the faculty and talking to the associate dean and explaining my predicament. But I wondered, you're worried about the close relationship between everyone in the law school, so you don't really know who to approach. But there's an institution separate from the school that was set up to address any issues students have. So you can go to the ombudsperson who is very independent from the university and hear your complaint. So I think that institution is very important when I was talking about this issue. We have to have an ombudsperson or institution that complaints can be made to, and they can look into this without fear or favor and all of those things. So I think that's an important aspect of it. And when we talk about support as well, I think one of the things I suggest is there's a need for us to take this matter seriously. And beyond policies and training and support for staff, it's important to ensure that there are sanctions put out to people who are found guilty of harassment, bullying, and all of that. And it's useful, and that falls within the power of the LPDC, for example. So if the LPDC should take this within its jurisdiction, it's also good to ensure that we have young lawyers represented on that committee, on the LPDC. I know that when it mentions lawyers, it mentions 10 years experience, but you don't need that. You need to ensure that young lawyers are also represented on such intern committees so they can contribute and make an impact. And this ties into the issue of respect I talked about earlier. We always think that because someone is young, they can't make a substantial contribution, which isn't true really. So the opportunity for young lawyers to also be involved in things like that, so that whenever there's a complaint, you know that you have someone who is your age, who is your peer, you can also, who is there, who can also make a case where you understand what you're going through.
Thank you so much, Olapo. Our online speaker is available now, so I'll just go to Dr. Itoro Ezeana. We have one.
Please.
It's a delight to have you here, ma'am. So, your question has to do with trauma management. We had already highlighted earlier that one of the issues, it's always a difficult thing for someone to come out to say, I've been sexually harassed. So, mental health-wise, how do you advise anybody to cope with their mental health? How do you advise them to cope with the trauma and the post-effects?
Well, thank you very much. And my name is Itoro Ezeana. I am not Dr. Itoro, just to correct that.
For that.
And I would like to just briefly go back to the issue of false or genuine allegations that we talked about earlier, because I've been online for a while. And also to support the other speakers that said it is lack of focus for us to begin to look at whether an allegation is false or genuine, because doing that will actually be a distraction. We should rather focus on what needs to be put in place in order to prevent sexual harassment or sexual violence as a whole. And the fact that once an allegation is made, the important thing is that it should be properly investigated with a view to assessing whether the issues raised by the complainant actually took place. And that means you have to gather evidence. And like the last speaker said, it's preferable if this is done by an outside person and not necessarily somebody within that organization, because then it will provide a level of credibility and confidence in that process. And in many cases, the allegation is usually substantiated by evidence. But when there is no evidence, it does not mean that it did not happen. So there has to be a thorough investigation before it could be proved that an allegation is genuine or false. However, we always in a hurry to say that it did not happen, probably because there was no sufficient evidence to prosecute. This does not mean that it did not happen. It's just that they do not have enough evidence to prosecute. Another thing that happens is that we always ask the question, why didn't you report earlier? Why did you delay for so long? It just means that the person or the complainant was not comfortable enough to report when it happened, and we're not in a position to tell her when she's comfortable or not. So it is left for her to make that report when she's confident that her report will be high. And the fact that the victim does not want to cooperate with the investigators does not mean that it did not happen. It could be because of shame, it could be because of mental health issues, it could be because of stigmatization, it could be because of pressure, like one of the speakers said, pressure from the superior officer not to continue with the investigation. So all these things do not mean that it did not come together and mean that it is a false accusation. It only means that the survivor is not willing to go through that process, and it does not mean that it did not happen. One other thing we normally look at is victim statement. At times we said that it is inconsistent. She said this to A and she said that to B. Inconsistencies in her statement does not result to false accusation. It only means that she might be embarrassed to give details of what happened to her, or she's afraid, it's shameful to her, or probably also fear of the repercussions, losing her job, or maybe mental illness. It's very common for someone that has been sexually harassed or molested to tell different versions of what had happened, or tell the bits of what had happened and not say the whole story at one time. So inconsistencies does not mean that it was a false accusation. And like one of the speakers said, false allegation is very rare. Usually it's between 2 to 5%, or maybe 2 to 10% at most. So rather than focus on false allegations, let us remember that it's better for us to put in place a mechanism that prevents sexual violence. So the questions we should be asking ourselves is why reports of sexual harassment or violence are treated with suspicion. Why is it treated with suspicion? Why is it never believed? And then when we do that, we can begin to understand what we need to do in order to lift those barriers that will enable survivors to speak and seek as I would give. And for the survivor, for the victim herself, I would always say that she did not ask for it. If you're a survivor or you're a victim, always report. And so for a victim, I would advise that you keep records, maybe the dates and times of whatever happened. Make sure it's fully documented as evidence of what had happened, especially when it is not a one-off incident, so that you can always present this to the ombudsperson, which I hope would always be available, so that the investigator or the person you're reporting to is not a member of that organization, so that you can have confidence in that person. And then for the law firms on how to manage the trauma of a victim, generally, it's expected that the management of the law firm or the workplace will provide an environment that is conducive and that is safe for everyone. So it is your responsibility to establish a safe environment for your workers. And this point, as you mentioned earlier, you need to train all the employees, including the managers and the supervisors on workplace harassment. What is acceptable conduct in your workplace? What is the culture of the organization? Or do you normally, that is how we do things, that is how we joke with people, those are the things we say. If the culture of the organization enables sexual harassment, then it is time to change that culture and bring out a culture that will enable your workers to feel safe and be able to do their work. So it is important that you send a clear message that sexual harassment will not be condoned. That is very important. And in terms of sexual harassment policy, which has already been mentioned, there has to be clear definition of what is sexual harassment. It has to be clearly stated that there is zero tolerance to sexual harassment as well as sexual violence as a whole. That policy must have a section on disciplinary action. When it happens, what will happen? What is the punitive measure? to the supervisor in case it does happen. And they must have confidential helplines. You must be able to report. You must have confidence in that reporting mechanism so that you can safely make a report. And there has to be an independent complaints procedure, workplace, or as the head of an organization. You need to monitor your workplace. Are there offensive jokes? Do they have notes that are offensive? Do they have posters that are offensive? It could actually be on your own desk. You have a poster on your desk that is offensive to somebody else. One of the panelists mentioned earlier that if there's a joke, if you're telling a joke, and she's walking past to get water from the water dispenser, and it's sexual in nature, she becomes a victim of sexual harassment. So if you're a manager in a workplace, what do? Do you monitor your workplace? Do you have an ear to the ground to make sure that your environment is safe for those that are working in that place? And then when there is a report, it is important that you listen, pay attention, and believe. It is very, very important. And once you listen, you have to affirm what you have been told. In other words, you can always say, oh, thank you for telling me about this. Oh, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. Give that person the confidence that it is not a joke, that it is not being trivialized by the organization, and that something important to be done. It's important that you don't ask questions that trivialize or blame the survivor. Don't ask the question, why didn't you report it? Why didn't you come to me earlier? Why didn't you go there? What did you do? Okay, what was your response to it? Those questions actually blame the victim, and they could be very traumatic. Don't forget that whether it's sexual harassment or sexual violence or rape, whatever it is, that is of a sexual nature and is offensive to the survivor, it is very traumatic. And so we have to do all that we can to make sure that the survivor does not suffer secondary trauma. It is important that we take the allegations seriously, which means that there has to be proper investigation and fact-finding. And there has to be a fair and objective and thorough investigation of the issue that has been complained of. You have to investigate promptly. It has to be done promptly. And then for the survivor or for the victim, you have to refer that person to a professional counselor or a mental health professional. And if it's necessary, you keep that private, the matter private, if it is so requested by the person that has complained. We need to remember that mental health is real. And one of the causes also is sexual harassment in the workplace. So we need to make sure that our workplace is safe for our staff and all those that are in contact with us. So we need to remember that when abuses occur, most people keep silent. They bear it quietly. They don't talk about it. They keep quiet because they do not believe that there's a system in place that will bring about any kind of accountability or that there's any likelihood of repercussions of the perpetrators, especially in an environment where people believe that false accusations and that false accusation is right. So if I work in a place where in the normal course of business, I know that people then believe there's false accusation, then I'm unconsciously being told that if I make a report, it will not be believed. And so we need to just move forward, with putting in place preventive measures to make sure that this workplace is safe. We should not confuse the fact that people have not reported the false allegations, but rather we should thoroughly investigate these matters to make sure that there is in place a mechanism that encourages reporting. We need to remember that 1 in 3 women is a survivor of sexual violence. And so we should not focus on whether it's a false allegation or whether it's a genuine allegation. Doing that is going to be distracting. Rather, our focus should be on providing a safe environment where survivors can speak out when there are issues of sexual harassment. And so the only way we can create positive change is to take action. We need to take action. We need to empower the victim or the survivors. And we always need to acknowledge that all of us, whether as senior professionals or as junior lawyers, all of us, including our loved ones, Thank you.
Thank you so much for expressing so much passion about this topic. We believe that the MBA has taken a few of the points that you have mentioned.